How do you secure a backend application? Can you share an example?
I use best practices like HTTPS, token-based authentication, and input validation. For example, in a payment API, I implemented OAuth 2 for user authentication and HMAC for request validation to prevent tampering.
What measures would you take to avoid SQL injection?
I use parameterized queries or ORM libraries like SQL Alchemy. In one project, switching from dynamic SQL to prepared statements reduced attack vectors significantly.
What about securing sensitive data?
I use encryption for data at rest and in transit. For example, user passwords are hashed with bcrypt, and sensitive fields in the database are encrypted with AES.
How do you improve backend performance?
I leverage caching, load balancing, and database optimizations. For example, caching frequently queried data with Redis improved API response times by 50%.
What type of data would you cache?
Static data like product categories or infrequently updated metadata. For example, in an e-commerce app, caching the product catalog reduced database load significantly.
How do you handle cache invalidation?
I use TTL-based expiration or event-driven invalidation. For instance, updating a product automatically triggers cache invalidation for related entries.
What's your approach to logging in a backend system?
I use structured logging for better traceability. For example, logging request IDs helped identify issues in a distributed system.
How do you monitor the health of your application?
Using tools like Prometheus for metrics and Grafana for dashboards. For example, I set up alerts to monitor API latency and error rates, ensuring quick responses to anomalies.
How do you handle sensitive information in logs?
I mask sensitive data like passwords or PII before logging. In one project, we used a logging middleware to sanitize all outgoing logs.
How would you design a system for high scalability?
I'd use horizontal scaling with stateless services behind a load balancer. For example, scaling a video streaming service involved containerizing services and using Kubernetes for orchestration.
How do you ensure fault tolerance in such systems?
By implementing retries, circuit breakers, and fallback mechanisms. For instance, I used a circuit breaker pattern to gracefully degrade functionality during third-party API outages.
What's your approach to database scaling?
I use techniques like sharding and replication. For example, in a chat app, we sharded the user database by region to reduce latency.
What's your approach to testing backend code?
I follow a pyramid strategy: unit tests for functions, integration tests for services, and end-to-end tests for workflows. For example, in a billing system, unit tests ensured calculation accuracy, while integration tests validated API interactions.
How do you debug production issues?
I use a combination of logs, metrics, and distributed tracing. For instance, a spike in 500 errors led me to identify a failing microservice via Jaeger tracing.
Can you give an example of a tricky bug you resolved?
Once, a memory leak caused DAC crashes. Using memory profiling tools, I traced it to an improperly managed connection pool and resolved it by adding a proper cleanup mechanism.